In 2009, a family drove into the mountains of rural Oklahoma and vanished without a trace. Their truck was later found abandoned, locked, and sitting on an isolated dirt road. Inside the vehicle were their wallets, phones, identification, and over $30,000 in cash. Everything you would take if you were leaving for good was left behind. Even stranger, a video recorded days earlier showed the family sitting silently in their living room. No conversation, no emotion, just three people staring forward as if something had already gone wrong. Tonight, we're uncovering the Jamison family disappearance, the abandoned truck, the eerie footage, and why this case still feels deeply unsettling more than a decade later. The Jamison family lived in Eufaula, Oklahoma, and from the outside, their life looked quiet and ordinary. Bobby Jamison, his wife Sherilyn, and their 6-year-old daughter Madison kept mostly to themselves. Friends later said the couple had been under stress. They talked about feeling watched and believed people were trying to harm them. In the days before they vanished, something changed in the home. Bobby installed security cameras and began sleeping with a gun nearby. Sherilyn reportedly believed their house was haunted. She thought spirits were following her and attaching themselves to the family. This tension seemed to pull them inward. They stopped trusting people and began isolating themselves from friends and relatives. Then, just days before they disappeared, the family recorded a strange video. It showed all three of them sitting silently in their living room. No one spoke, no one smiled. They simply stared ahead, motionless, as if waiting for something. People who watched the video later said it felt wrong, not staged, not dramatic, just deeply unsettling. On October 8, 2009, the Jamisons packed their truck and left home. They told relatives they were looking at a piece of land in the mountains. They never came back. 8 days later, their truck was found in Latimer County, deep in the Sans Bois Mountains. It was parked on a dirt road, miles from anywhere. The truck was locked. There were no signs of a struggle or accident. Inside were the family's wallets, phones, IDs, and GPS unit. Even more shocking, over $30,000 in cash was sitting in the vehicle. Their dog was found alive inside the truck. It was weak and dehydrated, but still alive. There was no blood, no obvious damage, no explanation for why the family would leave everything behind. Search teams were sent into the area immediately. Helicopters flew overhead while volunteers combed the woods. The terrain was rough and unforgiving, thick brush, steep hills, and almost no clear paths. Despite the effort, no trace of the family was found, no footprints, no clothing, no campsite. As days turned into weeks, theories began to form. Some believed the family had been attacked. Others believed they had fled into the woods willingly, driven by fear or paranoia. One detail made investigators pause. The family was lightly dressed for the terrain and weather. If they had planned to hike far, they were not prepared. That raised questions about why they left the truck at all. The money left behind added to the mystery. People do not abandon cash like that unless something has gone very wrong. Months passed, then years. The case grew colder as searches failed to turn up anything new. Then in 2013, nearly 4 years later, a discovery was made. Hunters stumbled across skeletal remains in the same mountain area. They were only a few miles from where the truck had been found. DNA testing confirmed the remains belonged to Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison. The discovery answered one question but raised many more. There was no clear cause of death. No obvious trauma was found on the bones. Investigators could not determine how they died. The way the bodies were found was strange. They were close together, as if the family stayed together until the end. There were no signs of an animal attack. No weapons were found nearby. Some investigators suggested exposure. Others believed something more sudden had happened. The family's mental state became a focus. Sherilyn's belief in spirits and persecution took center stage in discussions. Some theorized a shared delusion pushed the family into the woods. Others argued that explanation did not fit all the evidence. The abandoned truck still raised questions. Why leave it locked with valuables inside and walk into dangerous terrain? Another theory suggested they met someone in the area, but no evidence supported a meeting or confrontation. The lack of answers is what makes this case so disturbing. Even after finding the bodies, the story did not resolve. The video remained in people's minds, 3 people sitting silently as if already detached from the world around them. It felt less like a goodbye and more like a warning sign no one understood in time. The Jamison family did not vanish forever, but they disappeared long enough to leave behind a mystery that still does not make sense. Their story forces an uncomfortable question. How much can fear change behavior before it becomes deadly? And whether the most dangerous threats are sometimes not outside forces, but the ones growing quietly inside a person's mind. If you had seen that video before they left, would you have known something was wrong? Or would it have felt strange, but harmless? That uncertainty is what keeps this case alive. It reminds us how easily a normal day can turn into the last one. After the remains were identified, investigators returned to the same question they had asked from the beginning. What made the family leave the truck and walk into such dangerous terrain? The location where the bodies were found was not easy to reach. Even experienced hikers described the area as confusing and physically demanding. That detail made exposure a possibility, but not a satisfying answer. Exposure does not explain why the family abandoned shelter, supplies, and money. Another detail that troubled investigators was how close together the remains were found. It suggested the family stayed together, not scattered in panic. Some people believe the family became lost. The mountains are dense and disorientation can happen quickly. But becoming lost does not usually make people walk away from a working vehicle, especially not with a child. The dog found in the truck complicated things further. It survived for days without food or water. If the family had planned to leave the truck for long, they likely would have taken the dog. Leaving it behind suggests something unexpected happened. One theory proposed that the family believed they were in danger and fled suddenly. Fear can override logic, especially when paranoia is involved. Friends later said Bobby and Sherilyn had been afraid of being targeted. They believed someone wanted to harm them. That belief may explain why they carried cash and weapons. It may also explain why they trusted no one. Still, paranoia alone does not explain everything. It does not explain why there were no signs of a struggle or why no footprints were clearly identified. Another theory suggested a toxic reaction. Some wondered if the family encountered something in the area that made them ill or disoriented. However, no evidence supported poisoning or environmental contamination. Investigators could not confirm that possibility. The strange video continued to haunt the case. It showed a family already emotionally withdrawn before the disappearance. Some experts believe the video shows signs of severe stress or shared delusion. Others caution against diagnosing from footage alone. What makes the video unsettling is not what happens, but what does not. There is no comfort, no interaction, no reassurance. It feels like a family bracing for something they cannot name. And that feeling is difficult to ignore. Years after the case, the mystery remains largely intact. Finding the bodies closed one chapter, but left the story unfinished. No cause of death was officially determined. No final explanation was accepted by everyone. The Jamison family case sits in a difficult space between tragedy and mystery. It resists clean conclusions. It also reminds us how fear and isolation can change behavior in dangerous ways, especially when people stop trusting the world around them. The family did not disappear into myth. They disappeared into uncertainty. And that uncertainty is what continues to pull people back into this story. Instead, there is a chain of decisions that only made sense inside the family's mindset at that time. From the outside, those decisions feel impossible to understand. That gap between internal logic and external reality is where tragedy often grows. People act on what feels true, not on what is objectively safe. The video recorded before the disappearance reinforces this idea. It shows a family already emotionally withdrawn and disconnected. They do not look relaxed or excited. They look like people under heavy psychological strain. That strain likely followed them into the mountains. Stress does not disappear just because the scenery changes. Once the truck was parked, the environment took control. The mountains do not care about fear or intention. Nature is indifferent, and that indifference can be lethal, especially to people already exhausted and anxious. The family's choice to stay together shows their priorities never changed. Protecting each other mattered until the very end. That detail brings a quiet sadness to the story. Love did not save them, but it never left them either. When investigators speak about the case, their words are careful. They acknowledge uncertainty rather than forcing conclusions. That honesty frustrates some people, but it also respects the complexity of what happened. The Jamison family's story is not about mystery alone. It is about vulnerability, fear, and how fragile decision-making can become. It shows how isolation can amplify internal fears. Without outside voices, those fears grow unchecked. The case also highlights how difficult it is to recognize danger in real time. Hindsight makes everything clearer than it ever was. People often say they would have done something differently, but fear rarely announces itself in obvious ways. It whispers, persuades, and convinces. By the time you notice it, you are already acting on it. That is why this story resonates with so many people. It feels uncomfortably possible. Nothing supernatural is required. No villain needs to appear. Just fear, stress, and one moment where leaving feels safer than staying. The Jamison family did not disappear into legend. They disappeared into a decision that could not be undone. And that is what makes this case so difficult to leave behind. As the years go on, this case keeps resurfacing because it does not behave like most missing person stories. There is no single moment you can point to and say, this is where everything went wrong. Instead, the danger seems to spread quietly through time. Small fears compound, stress builds, and decisions slowly drift away from what feels rational. People often ask whether this tragedy could have been prevented. That question is painful because it assumes someone would have recognized the warning signs in time. The truth is, those signs were subtle. Fear, isolation, and mistrust do not always look like emergencies from the outside. Friends later said the family had become withdrawn, but withdrawal can look like privacy, not crisis. Without a clear line between concern and danger, intervention rarely happens. People hesitate to step in when nothing looks obviously wrong. This case also highlights how mental strain can alter perception. What feels like protection in one moment can become risk in the next. Once fear reframes the world, danger feels everywhere except where you are moving. That is how people walk toward harm, believing they are escaping it. The Jamison family's story forces us to think about how fragile judgment can be. Even intelligent, loving people can make choices that lead them into danger, not because they are careless, but because they are afraid. Fear changes the rules without telling you. The mountains where they were found remain quiet. Hikers pass through without knowing what happened there. Nature absorbs tragedy without reaction. It does not explain, justify, or warn. That silence mirrors the case itself. There are no final answers, only interpretations. Some people will always believe there was an unseen threat. Others will always believe the danger came from within. Both views try to make sense of the same facts. Neither can fully explain the outcome. What remains is the human cost, a family lost, questions unanswered, and a story that refuses to settle. The Jamison family did not set out to become a mystery. They set out on a normal day with a simple goal. What happened after that moment reminds us how quickly life can tilt. One decision can change everything, and sometimes the most dangerous moment is not the one that looks dramatic. It is the quiet one where fear quietly takes the lead. Investigators also looked closely at the timeline after the truck was found. The family had likely been in the area for several days before anyone knew something was wrong. Search teams later admitted the terrain made early searches difficult. Dense forest, uneven ground, and limited visibility meant small details could be missed easily. This raised a painful possibility. The family may have been close during searches but never seen. That idea alone unsettles many people. Help may have been nearby, yet completely out of reach. The distance between the truck and the remains was not extreme, but it was deceptive. What looks close on a map can feel endless on foot in that terrain. Carrying a child through that environment would have slowed them even more. Fatigue would have set in quickly. If exposure played a role, it would not have been immediate. It would have been gradual, confusing, and frightening. That kind of death rarely leaves clear evidence on bones. It often leaves only questions. Still, exposure does not explain the beginning of the story. It does not explain the choice to leave the truck in the first place. Some investigators believed fear was the trigger, a sudden belief that staying put was more dangerous than leaving. Fear can narrow judgment. It can make flight feel safer than shelter, even when logic says otherwise. The family's previous behavior supports this idea. They had already shown signs of deep distrust and paranoia. Security cameras, weapons, and isolation all point to a growing sense of threat. That mindset does not disappear once you leave home. If they believed someone was following them, stopping the truck might have felt unsafe. Walking away may have felt like escape. But there is still the issue of preparation. They were not dressed or equipped for a long hike. Explain that part has always been difficult. Panic may push people to act without planning. Another unsettling detail is the silence after they left home. No phone calls, no messages, no attempts to reach out. Their phones were found in the truck, untouched. That suggests communication stopped abruptly. Whatever decision they made, it happened quickly. There was no long debate, no gradual transition. Some people believe the family intended to walk only a short distance, perhaps to look at land or check something nearby. If that was the case, something went wrong early. A wrong turn, a fall, or a sudden medical issue. Others argue the family may have believed they were being chased. That belief alone could drive them deeper into danger. Without witnesses, every explanation remains incomplete. The mountains kept their secret too well. When the remains were found, the lack of trauma confused many. There were no clear injuries that explained death, no weapon wounds, no broken bones that told a clear story. This absence of evidence frustrated investigators. It also fueled speculation. Some wondered if animals played a role, but animal predation usually leaves marks. Others wondered if a sudden medical emergency affected one parent. But that still does not explain the full outcome. The fact that the family stayed together until the end matters. It suggests love and unity, not chaos. They did not abandon one another. They did not scatter. That detail makes the tragedy heavier. It shows they faced whatever happened side by side. As the years passed, official statements became quieter. The case was never formally closed with a clear answer. It remained listed as undetermined, a word that sounds neutral but feels cruel. For the families left behind, that uncertainty is permanent. There is no single explanation to accept. For the public, the case becomes a mirror. People project their own fears onto it. Some see mental illness as the core issue, others see environmental danger, some believe there was an unseen threat, others believe there was only the mind turning inward. Each interpretation says something about the person choosing it. The case becomes personal. That is why discussions about the Jamison family never truly end. Everyone wants the missing piece, but sometimes there is no missing piece. Sometimes tragedy is built from many small failures. Fear, isolation, terrain, and exhaustion may have aligned at the worst possible moment. If that is true, the lesson is not about mystery, but about vulnerability. The Jamison family did not set out to disappear. They set out to look at land. What followed was not planned. It was a chain reaction, and once that chain began, it did not stop until it was too late. What makes this case especially hard to accept is how ordinary the starting point was. Families look at land all the time without anything going wrong. There was no storm reported that day, no extreme weather that forced a sudden decision. The danger did not announce itself clearly. That means whatever pushed the family out of the truck felt urgent to them, even if it did not look urgent to anyone else. Perception became reality in that moment. This is where fear becomes as powerful as any physical threat. Once fear convinces you that staying is dangerous, movement feels like survival. Some investigators believe the family experienced a shared panic. One person's fear may have spread quickly to the others. When fear is shared, logic often disappears. Decisions are made emotionally, not strategically. The presence of a child changes everything. Parents will risk themselves if they believe it keeps their child safe. Walking into the woods may have felt like protection. Staying near the road may have felt exposed. The fact that the truck was locked suggests intention. They did not flee recklessly in all directions. Locking the truck implies they believed they would return. That belief is one of the saddest details in the case. If they expected to come back, then whatever happened came later. Something prevented that return. The dog being left behind fits that idea as well. People rarely leave a pet unless they think it will be temporary. Once inside the forest, conditions would have changed quickly. The ground is uneven, visibility is poor, and paths are unclear. Disorientation can happen faster than people expect, especially when stress and fatigue are already present. As daylight fades, the environment becomes even more dangerous. Familiar landmarks disappear. For a child, that environment would have been terrifying. For parents, that fear would have multiplied. If someone fell or became injured, movement would slow, panic would increase. Staying together would have felt like the only option. Splitting up would have been unthinkable. That may explain why the remains were found close to one another. The family never stopped acting as a unit. At some point, exhaustion would have set in. Exposure does not always look dramatic. It often looks quiet. People become weak, confused, and eventually unable to continue. This kind of death leaves few answers behind. Bones do not tell stories easily. Investigators had no timeline for the final hours. There were no witnesses and no recordings. Without that information, conclusions remain guesses. The truth stays locked in a moment no one saw. That is why the Jamison family case still feels unresolved. Even with remains recovered, clarity never arrived. It challenges the idea that every tragedy has a clear cause. Some events are shaped by many small forces at once. Fear, isolation, terrain, and mental strain may have combined into something fatal. No single factor explains everything. This makes the story harder to categorize. It is not purely a crime and not purely an accident. It exists in the uncomfortable space between. That space is where many real tragedies live. People continue to revisit the case because it feels incomplete. The human mind resists unfinished stories. But not all stories offer closure. Some only offer lessons. The Jamison family reminds us how quickly circumstances can shift. A routine plan can become a life-altering decision. And once fear takes control, Even familiar choices can lead somewhere dangerous. That is what makes this case linger. It does not warn us about strangers. It warns us about the moment fear convinces us to move when staying might have been safer. And sometimes, by the time we realize that, it is already too late. Another reason this case stays with people is how little noise it made at the time. There were no emergency calls, no frantic messages, and no warning signs anyone outside the family could respond to. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, the moment to intervene was already gone. That silence is one of the hardest parts to accept. Many people focus on the money left in the truck because it feels so irrational. Cash is security, and people do not abandon it unless they believe it no longer matters. That detail suggests the family's fear outweighed their sense of practicality. Whatever they believed was happening felt more dangerous than losing everything. Some have suggested the family might have been planning to move permanently. They point to the cash and supplies as signs of preparation. But that theory struggles to explain the lack of clothing, equipment, or long-term planning. If they intended to disappear, they were unprepared to survive. Others have suggested drugs or toxic exposure altered their thinking, but no evidence ever confirmed that possibility. The case repeatedly returns to the same uncomfortable truth. There is no single explanation that fits every detail. There is something deeply unsettling about how normal the last known actions were. Packing a truck, driving into the mountains, and planning to look at land is not unusual behavior. Nothing about that plan should have ended in tragedy, and yet it did. That disconnect is why people keep returning to this case. It breaks the expectation that danger announces itself clearly. Instead, danger arrived disguised as a routine decision, a simple choice to stop, step out, and walk a short distance. The locked truck suggests the family believed they were making a temporary move. They did not think they were leaving their lives behind. Temporary decisions can become permanent when conditions shift quickly, especially when fear or confusion clouds judgment. One of the hardest questions to answer is why no one turned back. Why no one said this is too risky, let's return to the truck. The answer may lie in how fear narrows thinking. Once a person commits to a direction, changing course can feel more dangerous than continuing. Parents under stress often prioritize momentum over reassessment. Stopping can feel like exposing a child to danger. If the family believed the truck itself was unsafe, returning to it may not have felt like an option. Movement can feel like protection in moments like that. That belief does not have to be accurate to be powerful. It only has to feel true in the moment. As time passed and daylight faded, options would have disappeared quickly. Terrain that looks manageable in daylight can become overwhelming after dark. Fatigue would have slowed them. Confusion would have increased. At that point, even experienced hikers can struggle. For people already stressed and unprepared, the risk multiplies. This is where the story becomes less about mystery and more about vulnerability. Humans are not built to survive every environment without preparation. The mountains do not forgive hesitation or exhaustion. They simply exist. The Jamison family case reminds us that not every tragedy has a villain you can point to. Sometimes the danger is a convergence of small factors. Fear, isolation, environment, and timing can combine into something unstoppable. No single choice looks fatal on its own, but together they form a path with no easy exit. That is why the case still feels unresolved. Not because answers are missing, but because the answers are uncomfortable. They suggest that ordinary people can make extraordinary mistakes under pressure, and those mistakes can be final. The Jamison family did not disappear into myth or legend. They disappeared into a moment where fear outweighed clarity, and that possibility is what makes this story hard to forget. It asks us to consider how we might act in the same situation. Because none of us are immune to fear. and none of us know exactly how we would respond until we are already inside it. As the story settles, one final detail continues to stand out. The Jamison family left behind no message explaining their decision. There was no note, no voicemail, and no sign that they believed something bad was about to happen. That absence leaves investigators guessing about their final mindset. In many disappearances, there is a last signal of panic or distress. Here there was only silence. Silence can mean calm, or it can mean fear that never found words. Some experts believe the family experienced a psychological collapse together. Shared fear can create a shared reality that feels impossible to escape. When everyone in a group believes the same threat exists, reassurance disappears. Each person reinforces the fear of the others. That kind of closed loop can be dangerous. It removes outside perspective at the exact moment it is needed most. The Jamison family had already been isolating themselves. By the time they reached the mountains, there may have been no voice left to challenge their fear. Others argue the case is simpler than it feels. They believe exhaustion and exposure explain the outcome, but even simple explanations can be devastating. Exposure does not mean peaceful sleep. It often means confusion, weakness, and fear growing stronger as the body fails. The lack of a clear cause of death leaves the story suspended. It never lands on a single explanation. That suspension is why people keep debating it. The case resists closure. When remains were found, families hoped answers would follow. Instead, the questions deepened. That can be harder than not knowing at all. Partial answers invite imagination. The Jamison family case sits between accident and mystery. It refuses to belong fully to either category, and that in-between space is unsettling. Humans prefer certainty even when it is painful. This story offers none, only a reminder of how quickly circumstances can spiral. It shows how fear can reshape judgment without warning, and how isolation can make that fear feel absolute. The mountains did not choose the Jamison family. They were simply there when fear met exhaustion. That truth may be the hardest to accept. Sometimes tragedy does not need intention. Sometimes it only needs a moment where staying feels dangerous and leaving feels necessary. And once that moment passes, there is no way back. When people ask why this case still unsettles them, the answer is usually the same. It feels like something that could happen without warning. There is no obvious villain to guard against, no single mistake to avoid that guarantees safety. The Jamison family did not ignore danger signs out of arrogance. They were responding to fear the best way they knew how. That makes the story uncomfortable because it removes distance between the listener and the tragedy. It is easier to believe a mystery involves bad people doing bad things. It is harder to accept that fear itself can be enough. This case also shows how quickly isolation can magnify anxiety. Without outside reassurance, fear feeds on itself. Once that cycle begins, rational choices can feel impossible. Every option looks dangerous in a different way. The family may have believed they were protecting their daughter. That belief alone could justify any decision in their minds. Parents often choose action over stillness when they feel threatened. Movement feels like doing something. Unfortunately, in harsh environments, movement can be the most dangerous choice, especially without preparation. The Jamison family did not know they were stepping into a final chapter. They believed they were taking control. That belief is what makes the outcome so tragic. Control slipped away without them realizing it. Years later, the case remains unresolved in the way that matters most. There is no clear lesson that guarantees safety. Instead, there is a warning about the power of fear. Fear can make danger feel invisible until it is too late. This story does not end with justice or answers. It ends with reflection. It asks how we recognize when fear is guiding us somewhere unsafe, and whether we would notice in time. The Jamison family disappearance stays with people because it feels human. ordinary, frightened, and irreversible. And once you understand that, the story does not let go easily. Even now, investigators are careful about how they speak about this case. They avoid strong conclusions because the evidence never supported one clear answer. That restraint frustrates people looking for certainty, but it also reflects how complicated the situation truly was. The Jamison family did not leave behind a trail of clues. They left behind absence. Absence is difficult to analyze because it offers no resistance. You cannot interrogate silence. The video recorded before they left remains one of the most discussed elements. People return to it again and again, searching for meaning. Some see despair, others see fear, some see nothing at all. What makes the video powerful is that it captures a moment without explanation. It freezes the family in a state we can only interpret. That moment now feels like a warning that was never understood, not because it was obvious, but because it was quiet. Quiet warnings are the easiest to miss. They blend into normal life. The Jamison family likely believed they were making a rational choice. That belief is what makes their story resonate. Tragedy often comes from decisions that make sense at the time. It rarely arrives announced as danger. This case also shows how hard it is to help from the outside. Concern does not always translate into action. People around the family noticed changes, but changes alone are not emergencies. Without clear signals, intervention feels intrusive. By the time something felt undeniably wrong, it was already too late. The window for prevention had closed. That reality is uncomfortable to face. It suggests some tragedies cannot be stopped easily. The mountains where the family was found remain unchanged. Wind moves through them without memory. Nature does not remember fear or intention. It only responds to presence and absence. For the Jamison family, that environment became the final chapter, one written without witnesses. The case continues to circulate because it asks difficult questions about fear, trust, and decision-making. It challenges the idea that danger always comes from outside. Sometimes it grows quietly within, and that may be the hardest part to accept, that no one else may have been responsible, only a moment where fear outweighed safety, and a choice that could not be taken back. That is why this story remains unsettling. Not because it is mysterious, but because it is possible. And possibility is often more frightening than certainty. As the story stretches toward its end, it becomes clear why people struggle to let it go. There is no moment where everything suddenly makes sense. Instead, the case leaves you sitting with discomfort, the kind that does not fade just because time passes. The Jamison family reminds us that danger does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it hides inside ordinary decisions made under stress. There was no single wrong turn that doomed them. There was only a sequence of choices shaped by fear and isolation. That makes the story feel uncomfortably relatable. Anyone can imagine a moment where leaving feels safer than staying, especially when trust in the world has already been shaken, especially when you believe you are protecting the people you love most. This is why the case continues to divide opinion. People want to believe there was an outside cause, something tangible to blame. But the evidence never fully supports that comfort. It keeps pointing back to the family's state of mind and environment. That does not make the tragedy smaller, it makes it heavier, because it suggests that sometimes the greatest danger is not an attacker or a weapon. It is fear guiding us into places we cannot survive. The Jamison family did not disappear because they were careless. They disappeared because fear narrowed their options. And once fear becomes the decision maker, outcomes can spiral beyond control. This story does not warn us about strangers in the woods. It warns us about moments when fear convinces us to abandon safety. That is why it lingers long after the details fade. It leaves behind a question with no easy answer. How do you know when fear is lying to you? And how do you stop it before it leads you somewhere you cannot return from? Those questions remain unanswered. And that may be the most unsettling part of all. As this story reaches its final stretch, what remains most striking is how little certainty it offers. Even after years of investigation, the core moment that changed everything is still missing. That missing moment forces us to sit with ambiguity. We are left reconstructing decisions without ever hearing the thoughts behind them. The Jamison family's disappearance is often labeled a mystery, but it is also a lesson. It shows how fear can quietly replace judgment without announcing itself. No one involved believed they were making a fatal choice. They believed they were responding to danger the best way they could. That belief is what makes the story so hard to dismiss. It does not rely on rare circumstances or extreme behavior. It relies on something universal: fear, stress, and the instinct to protect. When those forces align in the wrong environment, outcomes can turn irreversible, and by the time clarity returns, there may be no way back. This is why the Jamison family case continues to echo. It does not end with answers, but with reflection. It asks us to consider how we respond when fear feels louder than reason, and whether we would recognize the moment when staying is safer than leaving, because sometimes the most dangerous step is not the one into the unknown, it is the one away from the place that could have kept you alive. As we close in on the end of this story, it helps to return to the smallest moment that mattered most. The moment the Jamison family decided to step away from their truck and into the woods. Everything else in this case spirals out from that choice, not because it was reckless, but because it was made under fear. They believed they were moving toward safety. That belief shaped every step that followed. Fear has a way of compressing time. It makes decisions feel urgent even when danger is unclear. In those moments, people do not think in terms of outcomes. They think in terms of escape. The Jamison family was not chasing mystery or danger. They were reacting to a world that no longer felt trustworthy. Once they left the truck, the environment took control. The mountains did not need to act against them. They only needed to exist. Cold, distance, exhaustion, and confusion do the rest. There was no dramatic confrontation waiting for them. No final villain stepping out of the trees. Just a slow narrowing of options until none were left. That is how many real tragedies unfold. When their remains were found, people hoped the story would finally explain itself. Instead, it grew quieter. No cause of death could speak for them. No evidence could reconstruct their final thoughts. The answers everyone wanted were not written in the landscape. They were carried away with the people who lived them. This is why the Jamison family case feels unfinished, not because something is missing, but because something cannot be recovered. We want a reason that protects us from imagining ourselves in the same place. This case refuses to give us that comfort. It does not say this happened because of a rare event. It says this happened because fear met the wrong moment. And that is what makes it unsettling, because fear is something we all carry. The Jamison family did not disappear into a mystery that belongs to legends. They disappeared into a decision that felt right at the time. That decision cannot be judged from the outside. It can only be understood as human. This story stays with people because it is not about crime or conspiracy. It is about vulnerability. It reminds us that safety is sometimes closer than we think, and danger sometimes feels like relief. And once fear convinces you to move, stopping can feel impossible. The Jamison family's story does not end with answers. It ends with a warning we rarely want to hear. Sometimes the most dangerous voice is not outside calling you forward. It is the one inside telling you to run. And once that voice takes control, the path back can disappear faster than anyone expects. The hardest part of this case is accepting that the most important moment was also the quietest one. A locked truck on a dirt road and 3 people stepping away from the only shelter they had. We will probably never know what they saw, what they feared, or what they believed in that moment. All we can see is the result and the trail that ends where the woods begin. If this story has a lesson, it is not a neat one. It is that fear can feel like a compass, even when it is pointing straight into danger. And that is why the Jamison family disappearance still unsettles people. Not because it is unsolved, but because it feels like a normal day that quietly turned into the last one.